On a bright Saturday afternoon, the backyard was alive with the sounds of laughter and chatter as the family gathered for a reunion. The sun filtered softly through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the well-worn patio where tables overflowed with food and memories. Helen stood near the edge of the crowd, her heart swelling with a quiet joy. This day was a chance to be close, to be seen, to be part of the ongoing story of her children and grandchildren. She adjusted her floral blouse nervously, hoping to find a moment of connection, a smile, a hug that would remind her she belonged. Her eyes scanned the lively group, her son Mark joking with his wife, her daughter Lisa juggling a plate of food and a toddler, and there by the old oak tree her granddaughter Sophie laughing with her friends. Helen's gaze softened. Sophie had been the apple of her eye since the moment she was born, a precious bond forged through sleepless nights, school plays, and endless afternoons of shared stories. Helen had always imagined that bond would only grow stronger with time, that she would be woven into the fabric of Sophie's life as naturally as a grandmother should be. With a hopeful breath, Helen moved toward the circle forming for the group photo. Children scrambled for spots, parents adjusted collars and hair, and in the center, the family photographer was busy framing the shot. Helen smiled, stepping forward to join the cluster of familiar faces. She could almost hear the click of the camera in her mind, the 100 snapshots of love and laughter she had shared over the years. This was her place, she thought. This was where she belonged. But then, as if the warmth of the afternoon had suddenly turned cold, Sophie's voice pierced the hum of conversation. "You don't belong in our group photos," she said bluntly, her tone sharp and unyielding. The words hit Helen like a slap, slicing through the air with unexpected cruelty. The chatter around her faltered. A hush dropped over the group, and all eyes turned toward the older woman who had just been so unceremoniously rejected. Helen froze, the color draining from her cheeks. She stared at Sophie, searching for a hint of jest, a flicker of remorse, but found none. Only the cool dismissal in the young woman's gaze, a barrier that seemed impenetrable. The family photographer blinked, unsure whether to proceed or wait for the tension to ease. Mark shifted uncomfortably, and Lisa's smile faltered as she glanced at her mother. In that suspended moment, Helen felt a profound ache settle deep within her chest. She had spent decades pouring love and care into this family, baking birthday cakes, attending school events, nursing scraped knees, and offering quiet words of wisdom. She had been there through marriages and divorces, births and funerals, celebrations and heartbreaks. And yet, here she was, sidelined by the very people she had devoted herself to, reduced to an unwelcome intruder in a circle she had helped to build. As the group reluctantly reassembled without her, Helen took a step back, her hands trembling slightly. She stood alone, the hum of conversation resuming around her, but now feeling distant and unreachable. The sun's warmth seemed to fade, replaced by a chill of isolation that wrapped itself tightly around her heart. The reunion, meant to be a joyful gathering, had become a mirror reflecting the painful truth she had long feared. She was no longer seen as part of the family. Helen's thoughts drifted to Sophie's childhood, the bright-eyed girl who had once clung to her hand, who had sought comfort in her lap during storms, who had whispered secrets under blankets late at night. She remembered the countless times she had rearranged her own life to be present for Sophie's milestones, the sacrifices made quietly and without complaint. She thought of the birthdays celebrated, the holidays spent together, and the stories shared across generations. All those moments seemed to flicker like distant stars, beautiful but unreachable now. Her mind wandered to the years that had passed since her husband died, when she had leaned heavily on her children and grandchildren for support and companionship. She had moved in with Mark and his family, eager to be a part of daily life, to contribute and belong. She had cooked countless meals, cleaned the house, and cared for the little ones with a devotion that seemed to go unnoticed. Over time, the warmth she once felt had cooled into something else, an obligation, a tolerated presence, a shadow in the background. Helen swallowed hard, fighting back the sting of tears that threatened to spill. She clenched her fists, reminding herself of the strength she had carried through so many storms. This moment, painful as it was, did not define her worth or her love. But it did force her to confront a reality she had tried to ignore. The family she cherished was fracturing, and she was becoming a stranger within it. The afternoon sun shifted, casting longer shadows across the lawn. Helen watched as Sophie laughed with her friends, their voices bright and carefree, untouched by the ache in her heart. She felt the sting of rejection, sharp and raw, but beneath it all a flicker of resolve began to glow. She had loved fiercely and given endlessly, and though she was hurt, she would not disappear quietly into the background. Standing there, Helen allowed herself a moment to mourn the loss of the closeness she had once imagined. But as the family moved on without her, she made a silent promise to find her place not just as a shadow in photographs, but as a woman who deserved to be seen and heard, whose love was not conditional on acceptance but was a gift given freely, yet recognized and returned. The reunion continued around her, laughter and conversation filling the air, but Helen stood apart, quietly gathering her strength. She was a grandmother, a mother, a woman shaped by decades of love and sacrifice. And though today had been a day of painful exclusion, it was also a beginning, a moment to reflect on what it meant to belong and what it meant to be true to oneself when belonging was denied. As the afternoon wore on, the laughter and chatter in the backyard never truly returned to the warmth it had held before Helen's exclusion. She found herself drifting to the edges of the gathering, a silent observer to moments she once felt part of. The subtle shifts in the family's behavior were impossible to ignore. Conversations hushed when she approached, eyes darted away, and the circle of closeness she had hoped to be included in slowly contracted, leaving her standing outside. Helen noticed how the family members instinctively turned their bodies away as she moved closer, creating invisible barriers that left her isolated. Chairs were rearranged so that she sat at the far end of the table where she was easy to overlook. When a group photo was retaken, she found herself deliberately cropped out, an unspoken agreement among the younger generation. The sting of Sophie's earlier words echoed with each passing moment, like a refrain she couldn't escape. She caught a whisper here, the faintest murmur of frustration or irritation when she passed by. Mark and Lisa exchanged glances that seemed to question her presence rather than welcome it. The children, once eager to sit beside her and share stories, now pulled away, distracted or uninterested. The warmth that had filled past gatherings was replaced by a coldness she felt in the pit of her stomach. Helen realized she was no longer the beloved matriarch but a tolerated obligation, a presence that the family could no longer find room for. Her thoughts spiraled back to earlier years when family gatherings were filled with laughter that included her, when her voice was a thread woven into the fabric of the family's stories. She remembered the holiday dinners where she sat at the head of the table, the birthday parties where she was the one handing out slices of cake, and the quiet moments where she and Sophie had shared secrets and dreams. Those memories now felt like echoes from another life, distant and fragile. Helen felt the weight of invisibility settle over her, a heavy shroud that dulled her spirit. She recalled the sacrifices she had made, the evenings spent cooking meals for the family, the weekends devoted to driving grandchildren to school events, the nights she had stayed awake comforting children through illness. She had expected gratitude, respect, and a place in their hearts. Instead, she was met with avoidance and coldness, as if her presence was an inconvenience rather than a gift. At one point, Helen overheard a conversation between Lisa and her husband just beyond the porch. Their words were low, but the tone was sharp and unmistakably dismissive. Lisa remarked on how difficult it was to manage the family's needs, hinting that Helen's constant presence added stress rather than support. Her husband nodded in agreement, speaking of the need for space and boundaries that Helen felt were not extended to her but rather imposed upon her. The realization cut deeper than any angry word could. Helen understood that she was no longer seen as a source of comfort or strength but as a problem to be managed. She felt the sharp pang of betrayal, not from strangers but from those she had loved and nurtured most. The family she had envisioned as a sanctuary had become a place where she was quietly edged out, her value diminished with each passing hour. Her mind wandered to Sophie again, the granddaughter who had once been the brightest light in her life. She remembered the long afternoons spent teaching her to read, the bedtime stories, the shared laughter over silly jokes. But now Sophie's gaze was cold, her refusal to include Helen in the group photo a stark symbol of the growing divide. Helen wondered what had changed when had the affection turned to alienation, the bond into a barrier. Helen's heart ached with the knowledge that the fracture was not just in the present moment but stretched backward and forward in time. The love she had given had not been returned in kind, and the family she had built memories with was slipping away. She questioned whether her efforts to be involved, to help and to care, had been misinterpreted or simply no longer desired. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the lawn, Helen found herself retreating to a quiet corner beneath the old oak tree. The breeze stirred the leaves above and she closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her. She thought of the family gatherings of years past, the warmth of shared stories and laughter that once filled the air, and felt the sharp contrast to the painful reality she faced now. The ache of loneliness was profound, but beneath it, a quiet storm was gathering. Helen recognized that her place in the family was no longer guaranteed and that she had to confront the growing distance with clarity. The subtle exclusion, the whispered frustrations, the deliberate avoidance, they all pointed to a painful truth she had to face head-on. Though the day had brought rejection and coldness, it also ignited a flicker of resolve deep within her. Helen knew she could no longer pretend that everything was as it once had been. The illusions of belonging and unconditional love had been shattered, leaving her to pick up the pieces and decide how to move forward. For now, she would sit quietly beneath the oak tree, gathering strength from the memories and the knowledge that she deserved more than marginalization. She would reflect on the love she had given and the respect she needed to reclaim. The family she had cherished was fracturing, but Helen was beginning to understand that her own sense of self-worth must not depend solely on their acceptance. As the reunion carried on without her, Helen felt a quiet determination bloom. She would not disappear into the background or accept being sidelined. The subtle signs of exclusion had revealed a painful reality, but they had also awakened a new awareness, one that would guide her steps in the days to come. The family around her moved on, laughter resuming in fits and starts, but Helen remained still, rooted in the truth of her experience. She was no longer the woman who would silently endure neglect and coldness. The journey ahead was uncertain and fraught with emotion, but it was hers to navigate, and she would do so with a quiet dignity born of years of love, sacrifice, and now, self-respect. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the backyard, when Helen's gaze fell on the camera resting unattended on the picnic table. It was the family's designated photographer's tool, a constant presence during gatherings, capturing smiles and moments intended to last a lifetime. But today, the camera seemed like a symbol of everything Helen had lost, a witness to her exclusion, a reminder of the cold dismissal she had endured. Her fingers itched to reach out, to grasp the camera and seize control of the narrative that had been slipping away from her all afternoon. The laughter and chatter around her felt distant, a background hum to the quiet storm building inside. She thought of Sophie's harsh words, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the sidelong glances that said she was no longer welcome. The ache of invisibility had deepened into something raw and fierce. Without fully realizing it, Helen rose from her chair and moved toward the table. The family members nearby barely noticed, caught up in their own conversations and preparations for the evening meal. Her hand closed around the camera, its weight solid and real in her grasp. For a moment, she felt a surge of power, a reclaiming of something that had been slipping through her fingers like sand. The sudden silence that followed was palpable. Heads turned, eyes widened, and conversations halted abruptly as Helen held the camera up, signaling an unspoken refusal to be ignored any longer. The family photographer, startled, stepped forward, mouth opening as if to protest, but Helen's steady gaze stopped any words before they formed. She felt the weight of their stares, a mixture of shock, confusion, and a flicker of unease. In that moment, Helen was no longer the quiet, sidelined grandmother. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman refusing to be erased from the story. The camera became more than a device, it was a statement, a boundary drawn in the sand. Helen's heart pounded, but beneath the adrenaline, a calm resolve settled. She stepped away from the table and toward a quiet corner of the yard, the camera still in her hands. Alone, she allowed herself a breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. She was not just a forgotten figure in the background, she was reclaiming her place, however uncertain that place might be. As the family members exchanged uneasy glances, Helen's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. She knew this act would ripple through the family dynamic, shaking loose hidden frustrations and unspoken resentments. But it also marked a turning point, a refusal to be diminished any longer. She thought back to the years she had devoted to this family, the love she had given without condition, the sacrifices quietly made. The camera in her hands was a symbol of those memories, but also a reminder that memories alone could not sustain her if she was constantly pushed aside. Helen's gaze drifted to the fading light, the shadows growing longer and deeper. She realized that she had reached a crossroads. The comfort of silence and acceptance of neglect were no longer options. She needed to find a way to protect her dignity, to assert her worth beyond the whispered dismissals and cold shoulders. The quiet corner beneath the oak tree became her refuge once more. She sat down slowly, cradling the camera in her lap, feeling the weight of both the device and the moment. The day's events had been a harsh lesson in the fragility of belonging, but Helen was determined not to let it define her. As dusk settled, she contemplated the path ahead. The family she loved was fracturing, and her role within it was uncertain. But Helen understood that the first step toward healing was to stand firm, to refuse invisibility and demand respect, not through anger or confrontation, but through quiet strength and clear boundaries. The camera rested in her hands, a tangible reminder that she still had a voice, still had the power to shape her story. She would carry that power forward not as a weapon but as a shield, a way to protect herself from further erosion of her worth. Helen's thoughts returned to Sophie, to Mark, to Lisa, and the others whose actions had wounded her deeply. She was no longer willing to accept their coldness as her reality. The act of taking the camera was her way of saying she mattered, that her presence was not a burden but a right. The family gathering continued around her, the evening light soft and forgiving, but Helen felt a shift within herself. The quiet woman who had once stood on the sidelines was awakening, ready to claim her dignity and chart a new course. She packed the camera carefully into its case, preparing to leave the reunion with more than just an object in her hands. She carried with her a renewed sense of self, a determination to protect her legacy and her heart. As she rose from beneath the oak tree and walked toward the house, Helen knew the road ahead would be difficult. But this moment, the moment she refused to be invisible, was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she would no longer be pushed aside but would stand tall, demanding the respect and inclusion she deserved. After the reunion, Helen found herself sitting in the quiet sanctuary of her small living room, the evening shadows lengthening through the curtains. The camera, now safely packed away, rested on a side table, a tangible reminder of the stand she had taken. The events of the day swirled in her mind, a mixture of pain, disappointment, and, unexpectedly, a spark of determination. She understood that reclaiming her place in the family would require more than a moment of defiance. It would demand clear boundaries, legal understanding, and a renewed sense of self-worth. The next morning, Helen made an appointment with an attorney she had heard of through a local community center that offered support to seniors. She entered the modest office with a mix of apprehension and resolve, knowing that this step was necessary to protect her rights and dignity. The lawyer, a kind woman named Miss Ramirez, listened attentively as Helen recounted the events of the reunion and the years leading up to it, the sacrifices made, the gradual exclusion, and the hurtful words that had become a pattern. Miss Ramirez nodded thoughtfully, her expression serious but compassionate. She explained that Helen still had significant legal rights concerning her estate and living arrangements. Despite the family's apparent disregard, Helen retained the power to make crucial decisions about her legacy and her home. The attorney emphasized the importance of clear estate planning to ensure that Helen's wishes would be respected and that her assets would be distributed according to her intentions, not by default or assumption. Helen absorbed the information with a growing sense of empowerment. She realized that, up to this point, she had allowed the family's dynamics to dictate her sense of security without asserting her own authority. The will she had drafted years ago, filled with unconditional bequests to her children and grandchildren, now felt like a fragile promise that could be easily ignored or exploited. Ms. Ramirez suggested that Helen consider revising her will to reflect her current feelings and to establish boundaries that protected her interests. Returning home, Helen spent the next few days reflecting deeply on what she wanted her legacy to mean. The memories of past kindnesses and shared love were precious, yet she recognized that unconditional trust had been met with disregard. She chose to leave her will intentionally blank for the moment, a symbolic act signaling her withdrawal of unconditional trust until she was certain who truly valued and respected her. This decision was not made lightly. Helen wrestled with feelings of guilt and sadness, questioning whether she was being too harsh or reactive, but she also knew that self-respect required clarity and firmness. She was determined not to allow her love to be taken for granted or her legacy to be squandered by those who failed to honor her contribution to their lives. With Ms. Ramirez's guidance, Helen began to draft clear statements outlining her expectations for respect and inclusion. She planned to communicate these boundaries to her family, making it unmistakably clear that her dignity was non-negotiable. This was not about punishment or retribution, but about reclaiming control over her life and relationships. Helen's renewed sense of self-empowerment radiated through her daily actions. She stopped accepting last-minute cancellations of visits without explanation and declined invitations where she felt unwelcome. She reached out to family members who had shown kindness and support, nurturing those connections with care. Slowly, she began rebuilding a circle of genuine appreciation and affection, separate from the fractured core that had caused her pain. At times, Helen felt the sting of loneliness more acutely than ever before, but she reminded herself that love must be mutual to endure. She was learning to distinguish between those who valued her presence and those who tolerated it. This clarity, though painful, was a crucial step toward healing. Helen also sought activities that enriched her life beyond the family sphere. She joined a local book club, volunteered at a community garden, and rekindled old friendships. These new pursuits brought fresh joy and a sense of belonging that was not conditional on blood ties or past grievances. Throughout this process, Helen kept the camera from the reunion nearby, a symbol of her refusal to be invisible. It reminded her of the moment she chose to stand up, to assert her worth, and to demand respect. The camera had been a catalyst for change, but the real transformation was unfolding within her. Helen knew the road ahead would not be easy. Conversations with her family about boundaries and respect would likely be fraught with tension and misunderstanding. But she was resolved to face these challenges with calm dignity, holding firm to the belief that her worth was not defined by others' acceptance but by her own unwavering self-respect. In this new chapter, Helen was reclaiming her narrative, no longer a passive participant but an active architect of her life and legacy. The journey was just beginning, and though uncertainty loomed, she welcomed it with quiet courage and hope. The weeks following Helen's decision to revise her will and set clear boundaries were a time of quiet reflection and painful clarity. Sitting alone in her favorite armchair, she often found herself revisiting the memories of her life, the joys and the sacrifices, the love she had poured into her family, and the coldness she had recently endured. It was a bittersweet reckoning, one that forced her to confront the painful truth that love, no matter how deep, must be mutual to endure without eroding one's spirit. She thought about the years spent nurturing her children and grandchildren, the countless meals prepared, the stories told at bedtime, the reassurance offered during moments of doubt and fear. Those acts of love were the foundation she had hoped would hold her family together through any storm. But as she sat in the quiet of her home, Helen realized that the foundation was cracking, not because of a lack of love on her part, but because the respect and appreciation she needed had been withdrawn. This understanding was both heartbreaking and liberating. Helen recognized that self-worth could not be measured by others' acceptance or affection, especially when that acceptance felt conditional or absent. She allowed herself to grieve the loss of the family she had imagined, the closeness she had yearned for, and the warmth that had faded into distance. But she also embraced the strength that came from acknowledging her own value independent of their validation. Helen began to reach out selectively, focusing on family members who had consistently demonstrated kindness and respect. She sent handwritten notes to cousins and nieces who had called or visited when others had not, expressing gratitude for their thoughtfulness and sharing memories that had brought them closer over the years. These small gestures rekindled connections that felt genuine and nourishing, a stark contrast to the strained atmosphere with those who had grown distant. In these renewed relationships, Helen found a sense of belonging that was not dictated by obligation or history, but by mutual care and appreciation. She cherished the phone calls filled with laughter and shared stories, the invitations to coffee that felt like a true welcome, and the simple pleasure of knowing she was valued for who she was, not just for what she had given. At the same time, Helen set firm boundaries with family members whose behavior had caused her pain. She communicated honestly, explaining that respect and inclusion were essential for her to maintain a relationship. When invitations were extended without warmth or when visits felt like duties rather than genuine connections, she declined with grace, choosing to protect her emotional well-being over obligation. This process was not without its challenges. Helen faced moments of loneliness and doubt, wondering if she had been too harsh or if reconciliation was still possible. But she reminded herself that love should not be a source of hurt and that her dignity required standing firm. The internal dialogue was a constant balancing act between hope for healing and acceptance of reality. Outside the family sphere, Helen sought fulfillment and connection in other areas of her life. She immersed herself in the book club she had recently joined, where discussions sparked new ideas and friendships blossomed. Volunteering at the community garden brought her joy and a sense of purpose, watching life grow under her care much like the family she had once nurtured. Old friends became a vital source of support, their shared histories and understanding offering comfort and laughter. Helen found solace in these relationships, realizing that family was not solely defined by blood but by the authenticity of connection and mutual respect. Throughout this period, Helen often reflected on the symbolic power of the camera she had taken during the reunion. It remained on her mantle, a daily reminder of the moment she refused to be invisible and the journey she had embarked upon. The camera represented a turning point, not just a defiance against exclusion, but a statement of self-worth and the beginning of reclaiming her legacy on her own terms. Helen's reflections deepened as she contemplated the nature of love and belonging. She understood that belonging was not about forced inclusion or enduring disregard, but about reciprocal respect and genuine connection. This insight reshaped her perspective on family and relationships, guiding her to invest her time and heart where they were truly valued. In quiet moments, Helen allowed herself to dream not of returning to the past, but of building a future filled with dignity, respect, and meaningful bonds. She envisioned gatherings where laughter was sincere, where her presence was welcomed without reservation, and where love was freely given and received. The journey was ongoing, marked by both hope and sorrow. Helen knew that some wounds would take time to heal and that not every relationship could be mended. Yet she embraced the process with a quiet courage, trusting that by honoring herself first, she was laying the groundwork for healthier connections. As the days passed, Helen found a new rhythm, one that balanced reflection with action, grief with growth, and solitude with connection. She was no longer defined by the pain of exclusion, but by the strength she cultivated in response. Her story was evolving, shaped by the choices she made to protect her heart and nurture the relationships that truly mattered. In this chapter of her life, Helen was learning to stand firm in her dignity, to embrace the love that was mutual, and to release the ties that no longer served her well-being. It was a process of realignment, a careful curation of the people and experiences that would carry her forward. Through it all, Helen's spirit remained resilient. She carried with her the wisdom born of hardship and the hope for a legacy built not on obligation but on respect and genuine affection. The journey was hers to walk, and she walked it with quiet grace and unwavering resolve. The morning sun streamed gently through the lace curtains of Helen's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the pages of her open book. There, amidst the quiet hum of a new day, Helen sat with a calmness she had not known in years. The journey that had begun with hurt and exclusion had led her to a place of acceptance and renewed strength. She was no longer the woman who had silently endured dismissal or allowed herself to be sidelined. She was a matriarch who commanded respect not through force but through the quiet dignity of self-worth. Her decision to leave her will blank had been a powerful statement, one that resonated far beyond legal documents. It was a message to her family that love and legacy were not entitlements but gifts earned through respect and genuine connection. This choice had unsettled some and surprised others, but Helen felt a profound peace in the clarity it brought. She was no longer bound by expectations or disappointments, but free to define her relationships on her own terms. Letters and phone calls began to arrive from family members, some tentative, others heartfelt. Among them was a letter from Sophie, the granddaughter whose rejection had once pierced Helen's heart. In her carefully written words, Sophie acknowledged the mistakes she had made and the pain her actions had caused. She recognized that the foundation of their family had been built on Helen's love and sacrifice, a foundation that had begun to crumble when Helen's presence was no longer cherished. Reading Sophie's letter, Helen felt a mixture of sorrow and hope. It was not just about the money or the inheritance lost, but about the love and support that had faded when Helen stopped holding everything together. The letter was an olive branch, an opening for healing that Helen accepted with cautious optimism. She placed it among her cherished memories, a testament to the possibility of reconciliation born from reflection and time. Helen's days took on a gentle rhythm. She filled her time with knitting, a craft that connected her to generations past and brought comfort in its quiet repetition. She shared stories with friends in her retirement community, stories filled with laughter, lessons, and the bittersweet truths of a life fully lived. In these moments, surrounded by new companions who valued her wisdom and presence, Helen rediscovered a sense of belonging that was authentic and unconditional. Her home became a sanctuary, not just a place of residence but a space of respect and appreciation. She no longer sought validation from those who had overlooked her but embraced the connections that nourished her spirit. The pain of exclusion remained a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become a catalyst for growth, a reminder of the importance of standing firm in one's dignity. Helen often reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the moments of rejection, the bold act of taking the camera, the legal steps to protect her legacy, and the emotional realignment that followed. Each chapter had shaped her into a woman who valued herself and demanded the same from others. She understood now that belonging was not about forced inclusion but about mutual respect and genuine affection. In embracing this truth, Helen found peace. She was no longer invisible or sidelined but fully present in her own life and relationships. Her story became one of resilience and grace, a beacon for others who might find themselves pushed to the margins. As she looked out the window at the blossoming garden, Helen smiled softly. She was Mrs. Ruth, a woman with stories to tell, respect to command, and a legacy to build anew. Her journey taught her that sometimes it takes being pushed aside to find your voice again. And when you find it, the world, your world, opens up in ways you never imagined.